The title of our lesson today is Better Days Ahead. Better Days Ahead. And the text from our lesson comes from the book of Psalms in chapter 30 and verse number 5. If you have your Bible, I encourage you to follow along and evaluate the things that you hear in Psalms chapter 30 and verse 5. The Bible reads, "For his anger endureth but a moment, and his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." And so a basic breakdown of our opening passage here is that tough, difficult times don't last. Yes, we may cry at night, but joy comes with the morning light. God's anger only lasts a moment, and that word moment there means like a winking of an eye or a short space of time. But in his favor, in his grace, is life, where we can find both strength and salvation. And that applies even and especially when we face long days and dark nights of sorrow and grief. Now, we had other speakers, the last couple, if I remember correctly, have gotten up and talked about all the things that we experience here at New Harmony, whether it's Marissa, Brother Pat, or Brother Billy's grandson, or people being sick, dealing with family members and friends that have cancers, and even the injuries that come through living life and doing things. It'll be easy to let that grief overtake us, but we can't let it. We can't let it. So that tells us that no matter what, we have to and we must endure, that there are brighter days ahead, and no matter how dark it gets, daybreak and morning will come in and to usher in joy. There's a quote from a song that I listen to, and it goes, "You never know the sun can shine until you open up the blinds." That's important because when grief wants us to shut out all light, to shut the blinds, to close the curtains, to recede into the darkness of weeping and despair, we have to remember that not only do we walk in the light, but we have to let that light in and allow it to guide in the joy that comes with it. I also want us to notice that there's a comma between days and ahead on our slide. Now, I'm not a teacher and I won't pretend to be one, but in the English, the comma can mean a pause. So that means that there could be a pause between experiencing our better days ahead, where we have to endure, where we have to deal with, and where we have to tolerate suffering and weeping for a while before we reach our better days ahead. So our goal and our purpose with this lesson is to draw confident strength from God's Word by examining individuals who we can read about experiencing their better days ahead. We want to do this so we can increase our faith and belief in God's love, support, and in His promise to deliver us better days ahead. We want to start our lesson by looking at Naomi in the book of Ruth in chapter 1 and verses 1 through 5. The Bible reads here, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And it came to pass and they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband." So Naomi's story starts with her experiencing the famine in Bethlehem, Judah, and she leaves that land with her husband to dwell in Moab and her 2 children. And in the time of dwelling in Moab, first her husband dies, and then later we read that her 2 sons die. And if we were to read verses 6 to 18, we'll see that there's actually only one daughter-in-law that goes back to Bethlehem, Judah with Naomi, whose name was Ruth. But instead of going back 4, where she had her husband, her 2 sons, and 2 daughters-in-laws, Naomi ended up going back home with just her and 1 daughter-in-law. Let's go to verses 19 to 21 of the same chapter. "So they, referring to Ruth and Naomi, went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass, when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them. And they said, Is this Naomi? And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" So Naomi says here that the Almighty dealt bitterly with her, the Almighty afflicted her, and that the Lord had testified against her because she went out full with a husband and 2 children, but came back alone for her immediate family member and with just 1 daughter-in-law. And it's interesting when you look at it, the word Naomi means pleasant, but the word Mara means bitter, so we can see how she was feeling in her soul and how grieved she was. Now, instead of reading the rest of the book of Ruth, we're going to go to chapter 4 and see when Naomi experienced her better day. In Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse number 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which have not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. And the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we see here that Naomi experienced her better days ahead when that son was born through Ruth and Boaz. And that son was born and given to Naomi to not only restore her life, but also to nourish or support her in her old age. We have to remember this time they didn't have a Social Security system or a pension or a 401k or IRA set up. So they relied on their children to support them in their older age. And we also see Naomi being blessed in that she's blessed to be in the ancestry of Christ. And it says that they called the name of the child Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David, and we know that Christ comes through the lineage of David. So even though Naomi had a rough start, she got to experience those better days ahead. Let's go to the book of 1 Samuel and we will read about Hannah. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse number 1. Now there was a certain man, Ramathaim Zophim, of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zoph, an Ephrathite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, but the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, or a double portion. For he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord has shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. So as we're reading thus far, we see that Elkanah loved Hannah, but she was barren and couldn't have any children. Peninnah had children, but she wasn't just satisfied in bearing children to Elkanah. She provoked and troubled Hannah for being barren. And this happened yearly, year by year. And it was a yearly reminder of Hannah for being childless. And we can see how she could be grieved and angered at this. Let's look at verse 10. It says, And she referred to Hannah was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. So while weeping sore, we see that Hannah also was in bitterness of soul, or she had a heavy soul. She was discontented, or we would say today restlessly and unhappy. In verse 11 it says, And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. And there shall no razor come upon his head, and it shall come to pass as she continued praying before the Lord. And it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli mocked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. He said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And so with the heavy soul, Hannah turns to God, which is what we should do, which is what we're encouraged to do. And she was praying so hard that it caused her to move her mouth, but to not make any sound. And in doing this, she was called drunken. So during this low time, when she turned to God, instead of being comforted and supported, she was actually chastised and called being drunken. And she'll go on later to let us know that she was praying and that she wasn't a child of Belial. In verse number 15 it says, And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunken neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Now I want to ask ourselves, why did Hannah want it to be known that she's not a daughter of Belial, and what were the children of Belial associated with? In Deuteronomy 13:13, he says, certain men, the children of Belial, are gone out from among you, and have withdrawn the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which ye have not known. So one of the things the children of Belial did was that they served other gods. And not only did they serve other gods, but they tried to persuade and encourage other people to serve those false gods as well. In Judges 19:22, now as they were making their house merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, beset the house round about, and beat at the door, and spake to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring forth the men that came into thine house, that we may know them. So we see one of the other things they did was also practice lawlessness and homosexuality, and they were so bold in their sin and their unrighteousness that they banged on the door and demanded that the man be brought out and set before them. In Judges chapter 20 and verse 13, now therefore deliver us the men, the children of Belial, which are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and put away evil from Israel. And so one of the other things of the children of Belial is that they were so evil that putting them to death was considered putting away evil from Israel. And then finally in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 12, it says, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial, they knew not the Lord. And that kind of sums it all up with the children of Belial, is that they don't know the Lord. They don't serve and worship God the way that he commands them to follow him. And so when we think about being a child of Belial, that means that they were close to Israel for the blessings, but they didn't follow God. Let's get back to our lesson text in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verses 17 to 20. Getting back to Hannah's story, it says, then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. And she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. So the first thing we want to notice before we continue reading the verse 19 is that Hannah's countenance changed because she kept faith in God. She hadn't received the blessing or the better day ahead yet, but she was told to go in peace, and that changed her countenance, and she was no more sad. In verse 19, and they rose up in the morning early and worshipped before the Lord and returned and came to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. And so through saying faithful, Hannah was eventually blessed with a son. But she will still see better days than these, because this child will belong to the Lord. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 18, the Bible reads, but Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So we see Hannah was true to her word and lent the child Samuel to the Lord. In verse 20, and Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife and said, the Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the Lord. And they said unto their own, and they went unto their own home. And the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. And so we see Hannah experienced even better days or more better days ahead when she ended up with 6 children. Samuel, who was loaned to the Lord, and then 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. Let's go to look at a couple examples from the New Testament. I want to go to the book of Mark in chapter 5 and verses 21 through 26. And we'll read about the sick woman. And to set the setting up for what's going on, let's look at verses 21 to 24 first. And when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and besought him greatly, saying, my little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live. And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. So what's going on so far is that Jesus is being thronged or crowded on all sides with people as he goes with Jairus, one of the rulers of the synagogues, to heal his daughter. And so far, the sick woman in her healing is kind of a byproduct to this story. It's like, oh, well, Jesus was going to heal Jairus, his daughter, and oh yeah, this happened too. In verse 25, and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things and many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing better but grew worse. So this sick woman, the Bible tells us that she was sick for 12 years, and during those 12 years, she spent all that she had. And every time she saw a physician, she only got worse. And the Bible tells us that she had an issue of blood, but this wasn't just some small issue. It was actually a plague. We'll read these two verses later, but in verse 29 it's called a plague, and in verse 34 Jesus tells her to behold of that plague. So let's look at verses 27 to 29 first. And when she, referring to the sick woman, had heard of Jesus, came in and pressed behind and touched his garment, for she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the plague. So just like this sick woman, we have to remain faithful that Christ and Jesus can and will heal us and lead us to those better days ahead. And in this woman, that faith is this woman's faith that healed her, and our faith can heal us too. Let's look at Mark chapter 5 and verse 34, where Jesus says this. And he, referring to Jesus, said unto her, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and behold of thy plague. Let's look at the story of Lazarus the beggar in Luke chapter 16. Now the complete story is in verses 19 to 31, but for the sake of time, we'll look at verses 19, start with verse 19, and we'll go to verse 22 first, and then look at verse 25. And we want to look at this story because those better days ahead may not come in this life. But if we stay faithful, we will one day experience those better days ahead. In Luke chapter 16 and verses 19 to 21, there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fed sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So as we contrast these two individuals, it says the rich man was clothed in purple, which was the color associated with wealth, and that he had fine linen and fed sumptuously every day. But Lazarus, the beggar, is what he was called. He was laid at the gate and full of sores, and he didn't desire to have a complete meal, get a slice of bread or a piece of meat. He just wanted to be fed with just the crumbs that fell from the table and have the dogs lick his sores. But once we look at verse 22, we'll see that Lazarus wasn't healed in this life. His better life came after his death. In verse 22, and it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in verse 25, but Abraham said, son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good thing, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. So Lazarus' better day came when he was comforted in death after receiving evil things in his life. You know, we can pray and hope for better days and that they come in this life, but staying faithful guarantees better days ahead, either in this life or in the next life, the life to come. And ultimately, when we think about it, we want the eternal comfort that comes with being with Christ, and not the momentary pleasure and relief that comes from being in this life. So with that, we want to look at, as we start to close out our lesson, we want to look at that staying faithful lead to those better days ahead. And I want to say again that no matter what evil, sadness, or grief we experience in this world, if we stay faithful, we will have better days ahead. In Hebrews chapter 11, I'm going to start at verse 32, and we'll read to verse 40. In Hebrews 11 and verse 32, it says, and what more shall I say? For the time will fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, and of Samson and Jephthah, of David also and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, attained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in flight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. In the beginning of the next verse said, the women had their dead restored unto them. And so far we see that some of these people received better days in this life where they was able to stop the lion's mouth, to escape the sword, were made strong, became valiant. But others didn't receive it until after this life. In verse 35, women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might attain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, bonds of imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, men destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in desert and in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having attained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So while some received some relief in this life, others were tortured, they were scourged, they were imprisoned, they were stoned, they were tormented, they were destituted. But they were able to endure. We have to ask ourselves, how were they able to endure, and what helped them keep their faith? If we back up to verse 16, the Bible reads, "But now they desire a better country, that is, in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city." So that they have faith and they desire to go to the city God prepared for them, so that they can have that eternal comfort after this life, rather than receive that momentary reprieve in this present life. Also want to look at Philippians chapter 1 and verse number 18. The Bible reads, "What then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayers, and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectations and my hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose I want not, for I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." So Paul writing tells us here that with all boldness, we know that dying as faithful Christians is an advantage, it's a gain. As he writes here, it's far better to be with Christ. So in his body, we're to extol and magnify Christ both in how we live and how we die. A godly life and a godly death will lead to better days ahead, because it's far better to be with Christ than in this present world. It's important because we will suffer, but don't let it take away your faith. First, I want to establish that we will suffer in this life. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, Paul writing here says, "Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." You know, there's a saying in the world that as humans we exist in one of three states. We're either going through a trial of tribulations, we're coming out of that trial of tribulations, or whether we know it or not, we're preparing to go through that trial of tribulations. And if we live godly, the Bible tells us that we will have to suffer persecution. So if you're expecting to not suffer persecution as you've never experienced any, you have to question yourself and ask, have I been living godly? And asking that question will help you work out your own salvation with meekness and fear, as the Bible tells us to. We'll look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17. When it comes to suffering, because there's this thought in the world that no good deed goes unpunished, and they say that to try to dissuade us from doing good deeds and say that being evil is okay at times because you're going to get punished anyway. But in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17, the Bible reads here, "For it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for doing evil." So it's better for us to suffer for doing that one evil deed than for doing 17 unrighteous deeds or evil deeds. For doing that one good deed than 17 evil deeds. And the reality is, it's actually worse on us as Christians if we turn from being righteous to go back to being unrighteous. In 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 20 to 21, the Bible reads, "For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. For it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness, than after they have known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them." The Bible tells us it's better to not know the righteous way than to know it and to turn from it. It's better to keep our faith, or to never have faith at all, than to have faith and to lose it. And those who do will face a worse fate at the end than had they stayed faithful. So that's my lesson for us today. I encourage us all to study it and apply it to our lives, and hopefully we can all take comfort from it. As we stated, this congregation has been through a lot within the last month or so. We're going to close our lesson by offering the invitation. I want to look at Mark 16, verses 15 and 16. The Bible reads here, "And he referred to Jesus, said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." And I know I kind of harp on this passage at times because there's this belief in the world that baptism isn't necessary for salvation, even though 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 21 says, the light figure whereto baptism does also now save us. I want to look at this and see what the words means from Strong's, instead of arguing that he that believeth not doesn't mean that you don't have to be baptized. So this is Mark 16:16 with Strong's number for each word. And we see that some of these words have multiple phrases attached to them in our English language, even though it's just one definition for the Strong's word. And we see that he that believeth not is just one word. It's G569. And so on the left we have Mark 16:16 written again so that we don't forget it with he that believeth not highlighted. And in the middle we have the Strong's definition, G569. Thayer tells us this definition means to betray a trust, be unfaithful, to have no belief, disbelieve. And as we start reading the Strong's definition, Strong's tells us from G571 to be unbelieving, that is translated to disbelieve. And that's how we normally think of this word, to be unfaithful, to be doubtful, to not have belief. But we can't stop reading there. After disbelief, it says, or by implication, to disobey, believe not. So we can read this phrase as also, he that believeth and is baptized should be saved, but he that disobeys should be damned. So if you're here today and you haven't been baptized, and you need to be, we beg you, don't be disobedient. Don't disobey today. You have this opportunity to come forward and ask for baptism or Bible study. Or if you're here and you have been baptized and you need the prayer, strength, and encouragement of the church, don't be disobedient either. The Bible tells us to bear one another burdens, and we can't bear that burden unless we share it with you. Whatever your request is, whether for baptism, for Bible study, or even just to ask questions to where you can reach that point, or the prayer, strength, and encouragement of the church, please make your request known by coming forth and having a seat on the front row as we stand and sing the song that's been selected.